Good morning, everyone. We're going to give it a few minutes for other people to show up. Quick question for those who are on. First of all, I was going to ask if make sure that you can hear me, but I just got a chat from Lori that said that she's happy to be here. So I'm going to assume that means that you can hear me. Please say yes. Okay. Also, I know you can see the slides, but can you see my webcam? I'm not seeing a response from anybody that they can see my, oh, yes, okay, yes, so you can. Okay, great. Not that you really need to see me in order for this to work, but I find that it's easier to pay attention, I think, when you have somebody's face in front of you. And also just, I've been going back over some of these webinars. Angie and I have been doing this together now for, gosh, well over a year. We've had a couple of different webinar series. And so I've gone back over some of them just to review and refresh. And I realized that in just about every single webinar, I have different hair. And I don't know if any of the rest of you are noticing that, but given the COVID continuing lockdown and everything, even though I'm in my office, you know, we can't get our hair cut and things like that. So during the brief window in California when salons were open, I went to my stylist and I said, dude, just like go all the way, you know, don't bick it, but cut it as short as you can. And the thing is that now that it's all cut short, I can see how much, look at all that gray. I have so much gray hair. So just something to share with all of you. I hope that you guys have wait, I was going to say, I hope you have as much gray hair as I do, but maybe I don't wish that. Anyway, it's great to be here, and looks like we've got a good crew, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Just a little bit of logistics. We are going to have a guest speaker today, and she's already here and watching, and we'll bring her on when and there she is. Hi, Jessica. When we're about halfway through, we're going to go ahead and have Jessica present her great presentation for the wonderful tool that she has that I think could be helpful for all of us in developing our vulnerability assessments and our adaptation plans. But let's just jump right in and talk about part 2. Now, I want to give a little bit of a recap of where we were last time. It feels like it's been a really long time since we were together. I think it's actually been close to 5 weeks. And again, welcome back. Again, briefly reviewing, we've already gone through part 1 of the adaptation planning process, but we didn't really get far. We got through the first and a little bit of the second steps of developing our adaptation plan. So I might do a little bit of recap and review as we move through this on some of the stuff that we went through the last time. So let's jump in. Oops, let's see, let me make sure that I'm sharing. Okay. All right, so again, since our last webinar, we had a suggested reading of the Tribal Climate Adaptation menu, and this is a really great example of one tribe's specific adaptation plan and their process for developing their adaptation strategies and their adaptation plans. And I want to look a little bit more closely at this outline of their strategies. This is for the Great Lakes region. And again, it's a really, really excellent resource, I think, for anybody to look at to get ideas for how they might want to frame their own, for any of you to do your own vulnerability assessments and adaptation strategies and make them very specific culturally and make them specific community-wise, because obviously we know that one tribe's adaptation plan or one community's adaptation plan is going to be specific to that community. So for this adaptation menu for the Anishinaabe people, it's going to have those specific issues and concerns addressed for that community. But I think that the larger framework that they've outlined here, these strategies 1 through 6 that are showing on the slide, these are really, really important, and I think a very useful tool for any of us to follow as an outline. So, I mean, starting with number 1, consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. I cannot emphasize enough how vital it is to consider cultural practices. If you try to take an adaptation plan that is just a boilerplate and you don't customize it to the specific cultural values of your community or the community that you're working with and for, then you're not going to have success. This reminds me for myself in my training as an anthropologist, it's the way that you approach people is to listen to their concerns and be respectful and believe in what they are telling you. So, for me, that's important as well, because I work for Paula. I've been here for 15 years, but I am not a tribal member. So I can't make the assumption that I know just from having been here for 15 years that I can just automatically say, here are the things that are going to be important to people in Paula. So do that first. Reach out, seek that guidance, make sure you get your buy-in, obviously, from leadership. And leadership includes not just your elected officials, your tribal council and what have you, but also your cultural and spiritual leaders. So that is a broad strategy that needs to be specific to the cultures that you're working with and the nations that you're working with. I love this strategy too as well. Learn through careful and respectful observation. So that's observing the people, and that's also observing the spiritual and cultural practices, whether you are a tribal member yourself or whether you are somebody like me who is an outsider. Observe what you are allowed to observe and be respectful of that as well. There's no faster way to destroy a process of trying to make positive change than having a negative approach to the people that you're working with, or telling them, well, this is not the way things should be done. The science tells us X, Y, and Z. That's not the way to create a respectful plan. Strategy 3, supporting tribal engagement in the environment. To the degree that you can, be able to re-engage or support continuing strategies or environmental and cultural stewardship and practices. So for the Anishinaabe, for this particular plan, there are 6 different strategies outlined. So for your community, that may be different, but it's still something worth looking at and including in your strategies. Obviously, number 4, sustaining fundamental ecological and cultural functions. And that's what our plan is all about. You hear a lot of talk about the difference between adaptation and mitigation, where adaptation is essentially acknowledging that things are changing and we're not going to be able to stop those changes. So we have to learn how to adapt to those changes with as little harm as possible. But I think that it's reasonable to also have mitigation strategies. Mitigation meaning we can actually stop some of the impacts and the effects. So we don't call it a climate mitigation strategy, but your adaptation plan can include mitigation. So again, here in this menu, it's maintaining or restoring hydrology in soils, riparian areas, water quality, plant communities, cultural use of fire, cultural approaches to harvesting and caretaking. So for your community, those may be very different priorities, but if we can maintain and restore the health of our ecosystems and maintain and restore the cultural functions that are tied in with those ecosystems and the health of those ecosystems, that can be a form of mitigation as well as a form of adaptation. This 5th strategy, reduce the impact of biological and anthropogenic stressors. So again, that could be considered another example of mitigation as well as adaptation. Anthropogenic stressors. So I'm sure you all know this, but anthropogenic is basically a fancy word for human caused. So if there are anthropogenic stressors, well, and we know that they are, identify what those are and do what you can to reduce those impacts, whether it's impacts from things like reducing the amount of waste, food waste, for example, developing a composting program or a mulching program, something like that. That's an anthropogenic stress, is the amount of waste that humans create. Or reduce energy use. For us in Southern California, where we are so much affected by drought, find new strategies for reducing water use to help protect that vital resource. And then finally, number 6, reduce the risk and long-term impacts of disturbances. So disturbances are created by all sorts of things. They can be created by things like wildfire, flooding, landslides, tornadoes, hurricanes, all of the severe weather risks that we've discussed over the course of our webinars. Those are all things that cause disturbances. We reduce the risks of those, then we can reduce the impacts, but it also ties back into bringing back in some management strategies that, at least in the Western world, have been considered disturbances that we don't want. So wildfire is an example, but we know that wildfire, when we don't manage it the way it's been managed by many tribal communities for centuries, when we stop doing that, we actually really increase the risk and the impacts of wildfire disturbance. So we can reduce a risk sort of counterintuitively by embracing what causes that risk and managing it in a way so that overall it reduces the long-term impact. So I just love this. This was the page 18 in the email I sent out about 45 minutes ago, just to say, please review this and take a look at it and see how it might relate to the work that you're doing. And, having said all that, if anybody has any comments they want to make, we've got a chat discussion question down here, and I should have started with that so you could write things in as I was meandering. But is there anything in here that stands out for you, or anything that you relate to, or even anything that you think you might be able to use for your own adaptation planning and your own strategies? So feel free to throw those into the question box, and I will read them out as they appear. All right, so let's move on to our next slide. So we saw this one the last time, and I just want to recap it a little bit, that the vulnerability assessments, the adaptation strategies, what is the overall structure of what it is we're trying to accomplish? So looking here at our adaptation strategy graphic, you can see that we have these concentric circles going in towards a really important center that shows the different aspects of adaptation that we're trying to mitigate. So the physical health, the mental health, the socioeconomic health, the cultural and spiritual health. And of course, because this is an adaptation planning process that focuses not just on the environment, but also on health, then that's why we prioritize that in this graphic here. We're not just looking at effects to the environment. The effects to the environment have an effect on all these other aspects of our lives, and we can link them all together as being health outcomes, health effects. So I wanted to just put this back up here again to remind people of what it is that we are focusing on, that all of these exposures in the outer ring, these things we've been talking about from the beginning, storms, temperature, melting ice, wildfire, drought, etc., have these secondary exposures that lead to these impacts on all of our physical, mental, socioeconomic, and cultural and spiritual health. And I just want to add in here, given the circumstances that we are in right now, I think it's important to also talk about some of the conflicts that we're dealing with in our nation right now, and also in the world, and some of the effects that they can have on our health. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm feeling a lot of anxiety myself if we look over in the mental health portion over, increased conflict and aggression, trauma, stress and anxiety, grief and helplessness. I think a lot of us are feeling those feelings right now. And I'm getting some notes from some of you. These slides are appearing cut off at the top and the right side of the screen. So and actually 2 of you have said it's not showing well. So let me see if I can fix that. Let's do this. Is that better? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up to me. I'm still without Angie today. So she should be back next month. And being able to take over more of the technical aspects of running GoToWebinar, which I'm still not great at. And actually we have a raised hand from Seven. So Seven, if you want to throw your question into the question box, we can do that. Or if you have a question that you'd like to ask out loud. Oh no, she says no, it was a mistake. Okay, that's okay, I understand. All right, great, thank you for that. So again, I was talking about increased conflict and aggression. So, from climate perspectives, we hadn't considered a lot of what's going on right now, the stress from the pandemic and the political conflicts that are resulting from people having different attitudes towards the pandemic and the way that we should be addressing it, whether it's in terms of should I or should I not wear a mask, or who do I believe in terms of, the science and the research of what's going on. But then let's add into that I don't want to say the resurfacing because it's always been there, but the cultural conflict over equity and race that we are experiencing, and just the way that this is being dealt with from a leadership level, both at the very top through the federal administration and then even at the local level. It's hard to focus on all of these things. They're all happening at the same time. So I want you all to give yourself a break. If you're feeling stressed out, I know I am feeling stressed out, and it's okay. It's okay to feel stress, and we have a whole community here that we can reach out to one another if we feel the need to talk about what we're feeling and reach out for some help. So please do that, because everybody's health is important, especially those of us on the front lines of trying to deal with these climate impacts. Okay, let's move on. All right, so we started out with that adaptation strategy that's culturally specific, and so let's look a little bit at culturally traditional health and healing strategies. And again, of course, those are going to be individual to every community. We're still on number 2 of compiling our long list of adaptation strategies for developing our adaptation plan. So if we start from this perspective of cultural traditions, then that's the place to start, as we talked about, in the previous couple of slides, that you want to do things that are going to be specific to the community you belong to, that you're working with, that include these important traditional health and healing strategies. And again, those are going to be different from place to place. Now we have an example here in San Diego of this Elders Circle, which is part of the San Diego American Indian Health Center. So this is, or it was, a weekly circle. I believe that because of the pandemic, they are not currently meeting in person. But this is for people of any age. You actually don't have to be an elder to come together and to meet in these groups and honor the elders. And honoring the elders can be honoring individuals that are, people in your lives, or people that you know and respect. Your elders can be those who have passed. And depending on your cultural practices, your elders can be non-human. The earth is an elder. There are, trees and rivers and mountains that have been here forever. Those can be our elders. But this is a wonderful way to bring people together, to be able to meet with one another, to be able to talk things through, to be able to have some, moments of healing. And regardless of what those are about, it's something that I think we can integrate into our climate adaptation strategies. Like I was just talking about, everybody is stressed out. It would be wonderful to have this circle that people could meet together and say, I'm worried about the heat. I'm worried about the effects on the trees and on the lakes and on the fish. And let's get together and remind ourselves that we're all in this together. And let's tell stories. Let's have some ceremonies. Those are all things that are really important parts of adaptation planning and cultural and community health. And whatever it happens to be for your particular community, that's what you can include in your practice. So this is something I would definitely list on your long list of adaptation strategies, even just as a general purpose. This is what we want to do from a cultural adaptation perspective. What can we do that is going to integrate our cultural practices and spiritual beliefs in a way that's helpful for the psychosocial resilience of our community, whether that's climate change or whether that's any of the other stressors that our communities are dealing with. All right, so we have a question here that you can answer in the question box if you desire, and that is how you might build on your tribe's traditions in your adaptation plan. So again, if any of you are willing to share, go ahead and put that in the question box, something that perhaps your community is already doing that you could integrate into your adaptation strategies, or something that just comes to mind that might be a useful thing for you to use as you consider your adaptation plan. So I haven't seen any responses to the previous question, but again, if you are willing to share something from your own community's traditions that you could use in the adaptation planning process, or as an adaptation strategy, I should say, then please go ahead and share that in the question box. Okay. So I want to briefly revisit the psychosocial and spiritual resilience strategies that we talked about a few months ago when we had Dr. Walker on the line with us to do his some of his psychosocial resilience strategies, that discussion with us. So I bring this up again just because this is one of the reasons that we developed this climate and health adaptation strategy and training, was because it seemed like this was the missing piece, that mostly adaptation strategies were considering mostly the effects on the environment, and yes, the effects on people in terms of heat stress and relocation and things like that, but not looking at the psychological implications of those impacts. Oh, and we do have a suggestion in the question box from Rahim, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. Companion planting to reduce the need of resources like water and pest control treatments. So maybe you can explain what companion planting is. I know what planting is, but companion planting, I need that to be clarified a little bit. But if you're talking about, restoration of ecology, restoration of landscapes, planting native plants. Oh, the Three Sisters. Okay, that's a perfect example. Yes. So companion planting, in other words, different species that work well together, different plants that work well together. So the Three Sisters is corn, beans, and squash. And I actually have a Three Sisters system going in my garden at home right now. The beans are now climbing my corn. The corn has already been harvested. And my squashes are coming in, and this is like zucchini time of year, you guys. I'm telling you, if you don't know already, don't turn your back on your zucchini, because your zucchini will be like a cute little zucchini, and like you go to work and then you get back from work and the zucchini has taken over the garden. They grow super fast. But that's a great idea. Yeah, definitely working together with different species that are going to support one another in growing and, I was going to say neutralizing, giving nutrients to the soil and restoring minerals and things like that. So yeah, that's a terrific example. Thank you for that. So again, in your long list of adaptation strategies, make sure that you include your emotional, psychosocial, spiritual resilience strategies in that. Protecting that well-being is so important, because when people feel like things are hopeless or they're scared or they're anxious, it can be easy to just kind of give up and say nothing I do is going to matter. And you can also make those protections culturally specific. So in some communities, not just tribal communities, but many communities, there's a stigma about having mental health problems. And so if we can develop strategies to help support mental health without formalizing it into, say a Western model of treatment, this is a way to help reduce people's suffering, their mental health suffering. So, we want to promote a sense of safety, calm, efficacy, hope, and connection. Those are the things that were shared by Dr. Walker. And if you want to review those materials, I believe that was webinar number 5. So we do have increasing literature emerging from the disaster response academic community that is applied to climate change. And no doubt we're having a lot of literature emerging from response to the pandemic. And I suspect that those things can be intertwined or are interchangeable within different stressors, being able to deal with different stressors. So given the psychosocial and spiritual resilience, I do have a poll here that I would like for you all to participate in, asking about your community's experiences with this. So let me go ahead and launch this. Okay, so the question is, has your tribe experienced trauma, stress, grief, and other impacts to psychological well-being as a result of climate change? So we have yes, psychological well-being has been severely affected. Yes, psychological well-being has been somewhat affected. No, not yet. And I'm not sure. So I see we're collecting responses, so that's good. Oh, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring out some screaming goat to get people's attention. Okay, there we go. And we'll give it just a few more seconds. We have 73% have voted. I'm going to give you 10 more seconds if you haven't voted. Now's your chance. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're going to close the poll. And let me share the results. All right, here we go. So we have 12% have said yes, psychological well-being has been severely affected, and I'm sorry to hear that. I wish I could say I was surprised. 48% yes, psychological well-being has been somewhat affected. That would be my answer as well for the Paula community. Only 4% no, not yet, and then 36% I'm not sure. And of course, the no, not yet was very specifically worded because it is going to happen. So we're not just going to say no, it's no, not yet. So for that 4%, that's great. Hopefully you can develop some strategies for when these psychosocial effects or the psychological well-being starts to be affected in your community. If anybody wants to throw an example or share an example, you can put that in the question box. For Paula, some of the psychological well-being has been affected by the stress of wildfire, particularly of feeling trapped and that worry that you're going to lose your home, that your family and your friends are, and your whole community is at risk. That has had long-term effects. People are very fearful now of fire, and some of our tribal members who have family on other reservations where homes and buildings have been lost, even though it might not have been their own home, it was their grandparent or their auntie who lost a home. And so that psychological stress, even though some of these major wildfires were, a decade ago now, that stress continues. So that is a big effect for us in Paula. And again, feel free to share if you choose some of your own experiences in the question box. And we do have one here from Dorette. Thank you, Dorette. Let me see. And she asks, have you heard of the caring economy and funding people who are caregivers as an adaptation strategy? This workforce is primary to community mental health and well-being. These are workers who care for children, elders, and people with disabilities. Having this workforce well trained in disaster response is important, as they are the first responders for the most vulnerable. We often overlook these folks and how critical they are to adaptive capacity. Wow, that I have not heard of that. So thank you, Dorette. Funding people who are caregivers as an adaptation strategy. Wow, what a great idea. I hope some of you have done that already. If you haven't, workers who care for children and elders and people with disabilities, boy, that is something we need in our communities for all sorts of reasons, not just because of climate change and pandemics. So thank you, Dorette, for that excellent suggestion. All right, let's see. Oh, and we have another one from Andrea Candelaria. Hi, Andrea. She says, wildfires have affected our gathering, food, and basket supplies. Lately, we have had several homes threatened by fire. It gets to be very daunting, and I know families that have not unpacked belongings yet in fear of another fire. And that's heartbreaking. That's heartbreaking. I mean, it's smart to be prepared, but there are a lot of people who essentially they have post-traumatic stress syndrome from these tremendous risks and disasters that they face. You know, that fear can be truly overwhelming. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, let me stop sharing the results here. All right. So again, reviewing just a little bit our psychosocial and spiritual resilience strategies. There are a variety of things you can do, from improving communication to delivering health and psychological first aid resources, building connection, and providing health education and psychoeducation. Those are writ large. Those are umbrella topics that you can find ways to make specific for your own community. We had our own, the Paula Climate Ready Tribes activity. So the Climate Ready Tribes is a grant program through the National Indian Health Board that we were fortunate to get some funding through. So one of our activities was to develop and distribute these digital and hard copy materials to the community about the various climate risks that they face, and to develop an adaptation community or a committee rather, to talk about what are going to be the best strategies for communicating with the community and making our materials and our strategies specific to Paula and the most likely to be successful. And then also to take a look at psychosocial, emotional health first aid resources and potentially develop new ways to try to deal with some of those stressors, and come up with a community referral system. So we're still working on some of those, and I would like to be able to report back at some point on how we're doing with that. But the stresses of the pandemic have actually made it a little bit harder than I expected to be able to start deploying some of those resources. So again, some more adaptation strategies. Let's not forget that we have to do adaptation strategies that are based on the physical effects as well. So when it comes to health, we want to make sure our health facilities are protected. So if you have your own clinics on the reservation, that's something you would have to partner with those folks on, if it's through Indian Health Service, or if there's local facilities that your tribal community depends on, develop plans with them for how they can work with you when there are some of these stresses that come up. But it can be things as physical as, you know, retrofitting a facility that needs some upgrades, but also things like within your community, making sure you have emergency backup power, you know, so generators for critical facilities like wells and, you know, wastewater treatment plants, and have a community response plan for emergencies, even if they're slow moving emergencies like droughts or heat waves. But make sure that your facilities are able to manage those particular threats when they do occur, as a protection for physical health as well as for mental health. Let me see. So yeah, that's critical. People need to feel comfortable that they have good physical health and medical health facilities to be able to help them through some of their needs. Okay. So we have this little brief exercise here, and I'm going to challenge you to help me out with our Prepare Paula exercise. So I want to see people's comments in the question box. This is a group brainstorm. So here is a list of some of the medium and high risk human health impacts that we have compiled for Paula. These are the things that we're dealing with. Heat-related stress is at the top, injury or death from wildfire and flooding, et cetera, mental health, inability to access emergency services, going down the list, there's all sorts of things to consider. Respiratory illness, decrease in fitness activity levels, interruptions to drinking water supply, et cetera. The one at the bottom, carbon monoxide poisoning due to power outages and use of generators. That's not something that had ever occurred to me until I started doing this work, that if there is a power outage and people put on their generator so that their generator can power their air conditioning, and that generator is not properly vented, it's getting into the house, that can cause carbon monoxide poisoning. I'm like, really? That's a climate change impact or risk? Yes, it is. And here in California, we have what are called public safety power shutoffs that occur in communities that are at high risk to wildfire. If there is a very high risk of wildfire on a particular day or series of days because of a high heat and wind event, they will shut down the power in communities. This might be something that Andrea, who's out on the Kauai reservation, that probably happens out there. So that is a climate change impact, but then your people become at more risk because if the power gets shut off, how do you get your air conditioning? How do you make sure people stay cool when the heat is high? And Dorette has a comment. She says, if you're building or upgrading a facility, make it meet FEMA specifications for evacuation shelters, which can bring reimbursement and make a safe place where people feel welcome. FEMA might have grants for this, also as pre-mitigation, and add solar battery walls for power to the plan. Thank you, Dorette. And we're super lucky in California that this PSPS situation with the power shutoffs, there is a California grant plan that allows people in these high risk areas to potentially get free battery backup for their houses and for their facilities. But that's a great thing to think about, is if you're building something new, think about what else it can be used for besides whatever its original purpose is. So that it can be pressed into service as an emergency facility or a cooling zone or something like that. And you can get FEMA mitigation funds for doing that kind of work. Okay, let's see. All right, so the question here for the group brainstorm is pick one of these health impacts. Just pick one from this list, and in the chat box or in the question box, put in an idea for a strategy to help mitigate or adapt to that particular health impact. And I'm gonna scream the goat at you guys again. Now, don't be shy. I haven't been really hard on making you guys throw things into this question box or participate, but you can even pick the easiest, which is heat. What would you do to help reduce the risk to health from heat? What would your adaptation strategy be? Not seeing anything yet. Thank you, Levi. Establish designated cooling centers. Yes. And Raheem chooses the infections due to tick or mosquito-borne illness. We definitely need to deal with that, which is, you don't think about mosquito-borne illness in California, but I know you do in other places, and we have to worry about it here too. But strategies for tick illness, community cleanup of bulky items. That's a great one. That's a great one for mosquitoes too. Clean up places where standing water might pool and create breeding ground for mosquitoes. A long-term one from Lori, plant trees. Yes, trees are great at absorbing heat. Let's see, food that grows well in the heat. That's a suggestion from Michelle Shaw. That's a great one. Erin chose respiratory illness. Not sure if there's public transit on the reservation, but possibly looking into grants for zero emission buses or transit vehicles to reduce vehicular emissions. That's a great one. Yeah, let's reduce as much as we can, not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also particulate emissions. Andrea says, we have purchased generators for tribal members to use in the case of long-term outages, and they educate folks on their proper use. Oh, that's key. And there's a lot of things that people don't know. Maybe people don't realize that you're not supposed to run your generator in your house. You know, that's a mistake that, you know, if you make it, you might never make it again because it can be fatal. Oh, I love this from Raheem. She says, I don't know if you're she or he, I apologize for that. Eat garlic, it can repel to a limited amount. Organic treatments like garlic guard can be applied. I know we also treat stormwater, catch basins, and similar locations to keep populations down. Oh, and Raheem is a he. Okay, he laughed. He says it's okay. I'm sorry about that. And I'm assuming you mean garlic. Eating garlic can help repel mosquitoes. If that's the case, I'm going to start eating a ton of garlic because we have these new mosquitoes that just bite your ankles, and I'm constantly scratching the skin off my ankles from these stupid ankle biting mosquitoes. From Joseph Owl, reduced access to affordable nutritious food, raised beds and gardening at each home. That's wonderful. I don't know how many of you are growing your own food, but I have my garden, and I'm very grateful for it, that I have the space for that. Pamela has addressed mental health consequences. Offer virtual mental health, wellness circle, or cultural services, especially in high heat conditions. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Oh, Raheem says that his coworker eats garlic every day and swears by it. Okay, well, it's a good thing I don't have a partner to kiss with my garlic breath. I like garlic, actually. So I'm going to give that a try. Oh, you guys are wonderful. Thank you so much for all these terrific suggestions. I hope you all are taking notes on how some of these things can be used. And I know some of you came up with similar strategies. I think Shannon Seneca had also mentioned a cooling center. So really important for those high heat days. All right, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Let's move on to our next slide. Okay, we're finally on part 3, which is evaluating the short list of adaptation strategies. So this is kind of, well, I was going to say it's where the rubber hits the road, but the part 2 is really your brainstorm of adaptation strategies, but now you need to make a short list. And you did the same thing with the vulnerability assessment. You developed a long list of vulnerabilities and then picked the ones that were most critical. Because you're going to have limited resources. That's just the way it is. We don't have all of the money that we need to implement our strategies. So you need to pick the ones that are going to be ranked not only by how much you need them, how important they are from a need standpoint, but also how feasible are they? Can you actually do this? You know, if one of your potential adaptation strategies is to build a 3-story community building that has, you know, separate cooling zones for every single person, and it's going to cost $2 billion. Obviously, that's a great idea, but it's not feasible. So you have to think about what you actually can do. And sadly, some of the things that are really important end up not being as feasible as we would like them to be. Make sure you involve your stakeholders. This goes back to the very beginning where you want to talk to people and see what are they going to use. So like one of our potential adaptation strategies is to develop a climate-specific app that we can roll out to the community. But before I'm doing the app, I'm actually doing a feasibility study to see, are Paula community members interested in using an app that helps them with their reactions to climate emergencies or gives them some strategies for how to reduce their impacts. You know, if they all say, I would never use that, that sounds terrible, well, then even though I think it's a good idea, it's not feasible. So that kind of feasibility is more from a community participation point of view. Are people actually going to participate in the adaptation strategy, that you suggested? And then, you know, so this is after you've developed your short list, you know, take it to your stakeholders or see what they think are the best things. And then just double check, make sure that you've addressed your adaptation your climate vulnerabilities adequately. And, you know, it may be that one of your strategies is to find ways to be able to deploy more strategies. So grant funding, for example, or partnering with surrounding communities so that you can work together to try to reduce the cost or the difficulty of a particular strategy. Oh, and we do have one more adaptation suggestion from 7, so I'm going to read that out. Addressing interruptions in water supply. Have emergency plies in central locations that get replaced every 6 months. Have a community well that is only used for emergency water use or small use during non-emergency and has generator to run the pump or solar power to be green. Also, old-fashioned hand pumps still work. Oh, and you can also do like have that be part of physical fitness, you know, so that people can get some workouts. If during the heat period, provide misting and cooling locations at pickup locations near bodies of water. Yeah, she says fun for everyone and recycled from the lake. I mean, yeah, if you've got that as a possibility, I love that. The misters are great for cooling and kids love them. All right, so again, just double checking on your list as you develop your short list. Check with your stakeholders to see if you're choosing the things that not only are going to work, but that they will actually use. And then we have step 4. So we organize our selected strategies into an action plan. So how are you actually going to implement your strategies? So this is where you choose who's going to be responsible. What department is going to do this? Is it going to be public works? Is it going to be utilities? Do you have a fire department? What responsibilities will they take on? What about do you have a tribal law enforcement department? What are they going to do? How long is it going to take? What's your time frame on this? Realistically, you're not going to be able to do everything all at once. And there might be some things you can roll out more quickly that you can implement right away. Other stuff that might take even several years because maybe you have to get grant funding or there's permits required. So lay out that time frame to get an idea of how long this is going to take you. Review the status, do updates to see where are we on this strategy? Have we implemented this? Or is this something we should have done that we haven't? Or are we ahead of the game? We actually got something done before we expected to. So keep track of your status so that you can double check on yourself and make sure everything's getting done appropriately and in a timely fashion. And then identify partners and resources, whether that's neighboring communities, whether that's people within your community. Funding, of course, is really key. Be sure to look for funding sources, not just in the government sector, but also sometimes there's private sector opportunities for funding and working together. We have our easy tool. There are columns in the easy tool that you can use to put these things down, develop your list of responsible parties, departments, individuals, what have you, and customize that so that you can use it to keep track of your status. And then, of course, rules about how the plan will be evaluated and updated. You do have to remember this is not just a document that goes into a binder and on a shelf, like seems to happen so frequently with some of our plans. You have to actually use it and figure out how you're going to update it. And there's a great feeling being able to go back in your plan and check off a strategy and say, we did it and it's working. Or to check on something and say, we tried it, it didn't work so well. What can we do? Let's evaluate that and see if there are better ways to develop that particular adaptation strategy. And then last but not least, synthesize and present the results of your adaptation plan. This is where you put everything together. It's all printed out and in writing, and you present that review, that draft for review to your tribal leadership, to your adaptation committee, if you have one, to the members of the tribal public, the community, so that they can take a look at it, or at least you give them the opportunity to look at it. I know from experience that not a lot of people are super excited about reading this stuff, but maybe you present a synthesis of it at a tribal council meeting, or general council, something like that, just so that people know it's there, posted on your website. But this should be a full report, something that you can provide to people and of course your leadership so that they understand what's been included, what you're going to do with your strategies, how they are going to be implemented, how things are going to be tracked. We have an adaptation plan template online at the Tribal Climate Health Project website that you can use. There's also a ton of other strategies and also adaptation plans from other communities that you can use to help you develop your own. If you have something that has a lot of nice photographs and easily understandable graphs and bulleted lists, make it something that people are going to actually want to look at. One way to do that is to get photographs of people in the community, and they look through and they go, oh, there's my auntie, or there's me. In fact, we did that with one of our tribal members who tends to be a little grouchy about things, and so we used his photo, and I said, look, we used your picture, and he was so excited that his picture was in there because he feels like people don't pay that much attention to him. I'm like, well, there you are now. People are going to see you in our plan forever, and he was just tickled. He was so excited. So things like that can to help you get a little bit of more community participation and community buy-in. So you can synthesize and present the results of your adaptation plan. We have an example here from the Puyallup tribe in Washington. They actually made a video, and we have a little excerpt here. It's a 5-minute excerpt. Although I tried to get it to play a little bit earlier, and it didn't want to play. So let me give this a try and see if it works. Let me try something else. Okay, let me see if I can get this to show for you guys.
Hail. My name is Annette Ryan, and I'm a full member of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I do think that it's unfortunate that we have done significant damage to our environment when we were given an opportunity many years ago to talk about climate change and to think about ways that we could make positive impacts to prevent the changes that are occurring today. But nobody wanted to think along those lines, and the government policy made it impossible for us to implement those solutions. So I think we missed a key opportunity to prevent some of the damages that we see being done today. People are river people. We are salmon people. So the loss of salmon because of climate change, the temperature rise in the rivers, and the loss of habitat along river banks really does impact us as Puyallup people. It is our tradition. It is our way of life. It sustains us. It's who we are as Indian people. I'm very concerned about that because it does go back to our children and their children. Our sovereignty, this tribe, was built on this foundation of being able to harvest our resources and fish in our rivers.
I represent our children from over 60 nations and teachers and administrators from around the area. We have told long and wide, our children are tired and they are hungry. And they want to come celebrate and have laughter and to continue to learn from their learning methods that we have found on. We respectfully
and for keeping the traditions going. Thank you. We welcome you to a shore to get some rest, share a meal, and share some music and dance. We have food up here waiting for you. Please come ashore. Welcome home.
about our tradition and our culture, and the fact that we're revitalizing our culture through community journeys, teaching our kids about the environment and the ecosystems. I am sad that we have just started, we're hunting and we're fishing and we're picking berries and really growing traditional medicines. And climate change impacts every single one of those things that I just mentioned. And so everything we're trying to do to reinvigorate and revitalize our culture and our traditional ways is being threatened by climate change. I said there's a crisis. There's a crisis here, and we have to do something about it.
Okay, I know that I think the audio on that was not great, so I apologize for that. I will send you a link to the video so you can watch it on your own. Actually, the full video is 20 minutes long, and it's worth watching, and it may give you some great ideas for maybe creating some videos of your own. All right, so let me resume sharing. Oops, wrong screen. Hold on. This is what happens when you let Shasta do technology. Or not. Let's see. Show screen. Okay. So that was a great example. Like I said, I will share it with the rest of you. And that actually takes us now, with a little over 30 minutes to spare, to our guest speaker. So Jessica, are you still there?
I am still here.
Okay, great. This is Jessica Cahill, and she works for an organization called Azavea on doing a variety of climate change adaptation work. And you know what, Jessica, you know more about it than I do, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and I'm going to give you the presentation controls, so that way you can go ahead and move forward yourself.
Great. Thank you. Can you all see my screen? Should say temperate in the middle of it.
I see it.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much, Shasta. And thank you for inviting me to speak to this group today. I'm really happy to be here. Shasta was just introducing Azavea, and Azavea is a small, about 54-person, we're actually a software engineering firm based outside of Philadelphia, but we are what's called a B Corp, so we're kind of a hybrid between a for-profit and a not-for-profit, because what we do is, obviously we try to keep the lights on and pay our staff, but we only take on projects that have a civic, social, or environmental impact mission. So we do a lot of work in the environmental space, particularly around water, a lot of conservation type work. We also do a lot of kind of transit and accessibility work. And then we do some more kind of out there things in terms of like artificial intelligence and machine learning, mostly around kind of identifying kind of where conservation lands are being disturbed or things like that. So still an environmental purpose, but that's Azavea in general. Temperate is actually the thing that I specifically wanted to talk to you about. It is a web-based application, but more importantly, I think for this group, it's actually a compilation of data sets. And I've been working with Angie for probably about 2 years now. Her EC tool is an amazing resource. And part of what's in the EC tool is also in Temperate. And basically in the last 2 years, we've been working together to try to get more of those, to basically converge those things a little bit more in an ideal world. Angie, Shasta, and I would be working on an application specifically for tribal communities that like blends the EC tool with all of the things that you guys have been talking about. So we're constantly on the lookout for those opportunities. But for right now, I want to tell you a little bit about Temperate, the data that's in there, and kind of the decision-making processes that we made in terms of figuring out what we were going to actually put in the application. So real quick, it is a subscription-based, subscription-based, it's climate change adaptation planning. It's technically a decision support tool, but it was designed specifically for small to mid-sized communities with somewhat limited planning resources. So a lot of the climate change adaptation plans that we had been seeing come out in the last 10 to 15 years, those were large cities, well-resourced cities that paid a lot of money to large consulting firms to create very specific plans for those cities. And those were kind of the only examples that we had. And we really saw a need to kind of provide resources to smaller communities that don't have sustainability departments, don't necessarily have a sustainability officer, but might have a generalist in the public works department or maybe the city manager's office that is responsible for all things mitigation, adaptation, and kind of in addition to about 10 different other things that he or she might have to do. So we really wanted to focus on that specific audience. But while a lot of the language you'll see in here is really specific for kind of municipal employees, people that can basically implement the strategies and policies that we kind of help walk you through in the application itself, it's really a Kickstarter for anyone looking to create both vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. And it really does follow the, at least the adaptation plan steps that Shasta was just going through, those steps 1 through 5. And I'll show you that real quick in just a second. And I don't want to talk too much about kind of what it is, because I'm going to give you a quick demo, but there are basically data sets in here that allow us to give people kind of a short list of what potentially might be most important for them to look at kind of off the bat. But we also give users access to a list of strategies that has compiled over the last few years between 42 different cities, towns, counties, and several tribal communities. So those strategies, that long list of adaptation strategies that I think was step 2, there might be some strategies that you all might want to take a look at here, but I heard some great ideas, and I think you guys are way to kind of cornering the market on all of the strategies here. In terms of what we built, we are a technology company, so we took a very engineering first perspective in the very beginning. We compiled these data sets, we built basically an application programming interface, which is fancy words for a gigantic database that you have to have coding knowledge in order to get information out of. We heard from the community that nobody can use that, of course. So then we built a very simple user interface on top of it where you can search things, and then people said, great, that's fine, now I can see it, I still don't know what to do with it. So after that, we decided that we needed to really build kind of a decision support tool that does a few things. So it gives users access to location-specific temperature and precipitation indicators. So a lot of the climate change data is kind of, well, there are different data sets. There's global data sets. There are data sets just for the United States, but it's basically like, here is time from 1950 to 2100 for every space in whatever geographic area you're looking at. And that's really hard to parse. So what we did is we built a service that gives you location-specific information, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. And we use the highest quality data. So we use the LOCA data set, which is the same data set that's used by CalAdapt. We also have a global data set in there that you can opt to use if you choose to. In the very beginning, just after you create your account, we have a suggestion for potential top hazards that might warrant immediate attention. One of the things that we were really careful about, or we hope we were really careful about, is not assuming anything about a community. The people who are working in these communities are the ones that know it the most. So we can kind of help along and say, like, here's what the data say, but you're going to be the ultimate decision maker in terms of what's the most important for you and your community. step-by-step instructions for completing both vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. You'll see it's like steps 1 to 5, kind of exactly like Shasta had it on the left hand of the slide just before. Some people have called it like TurboTax. It's really very linear. And then that access to the action strategies, then I'll show you that in a second. So when I show you how easy it is to create an account, I'll point this out, but all of the information is specific. Obviously, we have kind of all of the locations in the United States. This is primarily a United States tool, even though we have access to a global data set. We do have some boundaries in there that we can show. So we can show county boundaries, and we can also show tribal areas. I believe this data set is limited to federally recognized tribal areas, but basically we used whatever information we could get our hands on. So when I show you the demo, I'm going to pick on Paula, if you don't mind, Shasta, but thank you. You'll see that the outline will come up, and I'll just have to trace it real quick. But before I get into that, the thing that we heard really pretty clearly from the folks that we were talking to is this data is overwhelming. There's a lot of it. I'm sure you all have talked about this. The EC tool is so chock full of information. What we were trying to do is really kind of hone it down a little bit, say like this, you're right, this is big, this is overwhelming. If you had to pick, if you had to prioritize and kind of create your short list, here's what you might want to consider including in that short list. And those specific shortlisted cards that you see here have the data behind them specific to the location. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I give you a quick demo. So most recently, I think, Shasta, we've been working together probably about 8 months, 9 months, something like that. And part of that is Angie kind of brought us together, and what we wanted to do is make sure that we had a good handle on what we're calling rural, hard to reach, and tribal communities kind of needed within temperate that wasn't there. So we are working off of a grant that kind of will help us increase the accessibility of the information that we have in there and kind of add new data. So we have recently added some maps. This one is specific to ozone, which is actually one of the health impacts of heat that I saw on that list. But also in a number of additional data sources. So we took some things from the CDC, Cal Enviro Screen, which comes from the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, the EPA, and the Forest Service. And you might notice that at least one of those is very California specific. What we did was, this is kind of a two-phased grant. And the first phase, we said, well, we're going to pilot it with California-specific data. And if that works, in the second phase, we'll kind of expand it to the rest of the states. So we are currently waiting to hear the outcome of our second phase proposal. So hopefully we'll win that, and we'll be able to kind of build off of this and add even more data. So just as Shasta was saying, that you can look through kind of a number of different adaptation plans from different communities. You really have to tailor it to your own community, make it culturally specific, make it community specific. So one of the things that we did was we thought this foundation of kind of starting with suggested actions that people have already come up with would allow us to not have to recreate the wheel every time. So we have, I think there are about 4,500 different strategies, and that database grows as more users kind of put their strategies in there. And again, I'll show you that real quick. But we feel pretty strongly that this database has a potential to really accelerate the learning. So instead of having to kind of go through all of those adaptation plans to create that long list, what if you could just search for them really quickly and kind of have it shown to you, like, here are the strategies that might be most relevant, here you go. Ideally, the user community would be adding strategies on an ongoing basis and sharing with one another and kind of learning from one another. And the ultimate goal would be to have this kind of database kind of open and available. Right now, that's not particularly the case because we don't have the funds to support that, but I am really excited because just last week, I actually, working with a bunch of folks, submitted an application, a grant application that would allow us to create that database that would be open and freely available. So, and everything that's in temperate would be brought into that, and that database has the potential to really move the field forward in terms of sharing adaptation strategies. So I'm gonna change screens real quick and give you a quick demo of what this looks like. So I'm going to show you how easy it is to create a new organization, just so you can see the data that comes up basically. One of the things that we did was we tried to make it as kind of open to collaboration as possible. So there's this concept on the very second screen to invite colleagues and other people that you might want to have working with you in the application. It's not something that you have to do, but it's definitely something that we're encouraging. But one thing that I should say right off the top is kind of echoing what Shasta was saying, that is so key to do that stakeholder engagement and community outreach. And one thing that Temperate does not do, and we know that it does not do it, is kind of provide an online facilitation for that communication. It's one of the things that we've heard repeatedly from people that they would want to see in kind of a next iteration of Temperate. We have seen a lot of people take the information from Temperate and kind of put it into a PowerPoint and kind of share it with others in more like an offline way. But it's not something that we kind of included in here, but it is absolutely critical. Anything that gets put in here, hopefully should be kind of informed by any engagement that you all might have. So here we go. This is the screen that I showed you just before. And one of the things, Shasta will recognize my complaint here. One of the things that I want to be able to do is literally just click on this outline instead of having to trace it. And this is one of the reasons. Unfortunately, if I get out of this, it'll make me redraw the whole thing. So I'm just going to cheat a little bit. There we go. Okay. So once I do this, once I hit next, every piece of information that I see will be specific to the geographic area that I just drew. So
when expected finish date, can you just put like the year 2 million?
Yeah, with 2029, how about that? Yeah, it's funny that we were trying to give people a goal, but we have heard from so many people, they're like, I don't know when I'm going to finish this. I finish it when I finish it, which makes total sense. But having just done that, having just picked a geographic location, and the finish date doesn't even matter for this, but using the data that we have at hand, we are saying, here are some things that you might want to consider including in your short list. So there are a couple things about these data. So we have a whole methodology page right here, and we talk about all the data sets that we use and how we pick the top hazards and the suggested risks. Oh boy, it's gonna make me go through all of that again. Here we go. It's because I clicked on this methodology page. But one of the things that we decided to do was use the average of the projections for 2025 to 2035. And this is kind of drummed up a lot of debate. So we did that because a lot of the people that we had talked to said, basically, I need to be able to plan for the relatively short term to near term. I can't, I don't have enough buy-in to kind of create a 50-year plan, and who knows what's going to happen in 50 years anyway, which seems legitimate. The further out you go using climate change projections, the lower the confidence rate in those indicators is. So choosing kind of a middle ground made sense. Now, there are some people that said, well, I want to see the most extreme scenario. Show me what it's going to look like in 2100. And that's absolutely something that you can do here. But everything that we're using, all of the data that we're kind of pre-populating, is really for the what we call the near term. So these are the things that are of potential concern. And these pieces of information, 2.4, more heat waves each year, more rainstorms, more groundwater flooding, that is very specific to the funky shape around Paula that I drew. This is spinning and I don't know why. Give me 1 second, I'm gonna reload the page because it's kind of important, and that's why. There we go. So even though these are the things that we're kind of using the data to say this is where you might want to start, it's certainly by no means where you should end. So there are a number of additional hazards that you can choose from to basically put on your short list. And you can always add things to the list, but we wanted to start small to keep it short. But let's see, maybe we want to put some airborne disease in there, and we're particularly concerned with, we were just talking a lot about mosquitoes. So let's do some vector-borne disease. Now, I should warn you as I move forward, I would love it if every single one of these hazards had a whole bunch of data behind it. It doesn't. At the moment, there's only temperature and precipitation data in here, and that's one of the major gaps that we see. There's definitely room for improvement in terms of the information that we can put in here. Now, one of the things that we do that not a lot of other systems do is we ask you to kind of use some community systems that you think are particularly at risk. So this was really designed to help kind of that generalist in a municipality or in a community to say, okay, I have a particular bent or angle that I am kind of attacking climate change from. So I would like to kind of include that. So let's say we're most concerned about agriculture, community and culture, and let's say public health, and maybe water supply. And these, again, you can always add to this list, but in an effort to kind of keep it to the short list, I'm just going to pick 4 here. So this setting up your plan is really just doing a one-to-one match with everything that we just chose. So it's going to take all of the, I can show you here, all of the hazards. So airborne disease was the first one on the list there, alphabetically. And it's going to pair it with each of those community systems that we chose. So airborne disease on agriculture, airborne disease on community and culture. And then you repeat again, drought on agriculture, drought on community and culture, so on and so forth. Now this list already, even though it's just your short list, looks pretty long and daunting. So we created this, what we call overview. It's on this dashboard. So it's really designed to kind of keep it compact and somewhat accessible. So all of the things that are related to airborne disease, drought, extreme cold days are kind of kept separate. I'm going to skip over this stuff over here. Location details are really, it's really a way for users to kind of say, you know, my community has already done a vulnerability assessment, and here we are in the process, or here's my budget size, here's my kind of decision-making process. So it's really kind of qualitative stuff. And the reason that we put that in there is because ultimately we'd love to be able to kind of create a matchmaking service where we help communities find each other so that they can learn from each other. It's not a current feature, but it's definitely something that we would love to see happen. And again, all of this is in service of kind of accelerated learning, not for the application itself, but for the people actually coming up with the plans and implementing the plans and doing the work, because we want to facilitate and ease, if we can, the burden of doing that work. So I'm going to jump right in really quickly, and I'm going to use drought as an example. So I'm going to start by hitting that assess button. And so one of the first things that you'll see here is you get all of the community systems that we looked at, but here we kind of also put in known effects of drought. So right off the bat, we're kind of trying to help you think through what drought can mean. So we put this map in here, and this is specific. Again, this is my poorly drawn outline of Paula, but this specific map talks about how drought has an impact on air quality. So again, I saw this in one of the impacts, I think, on the heat slide, but droughts can lead to higher levels of particulate matter, chemicals, dust, soot, and metals in the air, which can obviously lead to things like heart and lung disease, poor public health outcomes. So we're trying to kind of help users think through what these specific things could mean in relation to the decisions that they have to make specific to drought. Now, obviously, thinking about drought is super, super big. So if you think about drought on a smaller level and kind of break it down there, it's a little bit easier. So you'll see here, this is that kind of stepwise process I was talking about. Step one is literally just a recap, so you don't even have to do anything on step one. Step two is where the hard part starts. So the questions are really about the probability, the frequency, and the intensity. Now, we won't have data for all of these things, but we will have data for some of them. So let's pick dry spells, which is basically the amount of time that elapses between rainfall. So just for Paula, right here, the geographic area that we drew before, and in the years, between the years 2015 and 2030, so that near term, here's what's going to happen. It might not change that much if we start at 15.56 and go to 16.5, so you have one more dry spell. But if you want to look at the historic information, it's kind of the same. Let's say we wanted to focus on 2010 to 2050. Now this kind of teal line, I guess, this dark line in the middle is the average. But if you see these kind of shaded areas, you can see these peaks and these valleys here. These represent the differences in the different models. So some models are projecting, what is it? That's about a 26. Some models are projecting, what's that? About an 8. So there's a lot of variation in the models, and different models are good at different things. So there are some states that have basically put out guidance that say you should use these specific models. California is one of them, Massachusetts is another one of them. So we use all the models, but if you know which ones you want to use, you could literally just pick those. And then the chart will kind of reconfigure. So you'll see there's a little less variation here. And this is specific, sorry, I need to silence this again. This is specific to one data set. So this is the data set that CalAdapt uses. We also have this other data set. This is a NASA data set, and it's global. So it may be slightly less specific to the US, but in most cases, it's very, very similar. So you can make all kinds of choices about the data that you want to use, and we'll link back to the original data if you want to see that as well. And you can also download the chart if you wanted to put the chart in a PowerPoint presentation, or kind of, compare it to what you see on another site or things like that. So there are all kinds of ways in which you can dive into this data. But the whole point of having this data right here is to help you answer these questions. So the probability is, it's moderate. It's not going to change that much, but it's potentially going to go up a little bit. So if I were answering this truthfully, I'd probably put something kind of like no change. But I'm going to pick an extreme answer just to illustrate a point that you'll see in just a second. So I'm going to say that droughts are going to be more frequent and they're going to be more intense. Not that that potentially is untrue, but for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm just trying to fill one particular piece so that I can show it to you. So step 3 is where you talk about the potential impact. And while we can kind of put these pieces of information in front of you, like here, I already showed you the air quality one. Here's one specific to San Diego County. Drought durations have increased from 6 to 13 months in San Diego County since 1976. That's a pretty big jump. 13 months with no rain is pretty intense. And here again, if you want to talk about extreme precipitation, so if you go a long period of time with no rain and then you get an extreme amount of rain, that leads to a whole other host of problems, potentially landslides. Your stormwater system can be overwhelmed. It can wreak havoc. But we're putting this information in front of you so that you can see this little tiny outline of Paula down here. This information is at the county level, so it doesn't zoom in very well. But you can see there are basically no extreme precipitation days, which is probably true, right, Shasta?
Well, actually it is depending on how you define it. So
actually, that's a really great point. So in each of these maps, we have a link to the source data. And so this one particularly is from the CDC. So if I click on this, we'll get taken away and it will all get messed up. So I won't do it. But each of these maps kind of has an attribution where you can go to the source data and figure out how they defined it. So maybe you want to define it in a slightly different way, but you need to kind of know what the source data did in order to figure out how you might want to change it.
So we're getting some great questions coming up in the box. I do want to point out we're getting close to the end. That's partly my fault because I took too long, but hopefully everybody can stick around and ask questions, and you will also have Jessica's contact information if you want to reach out to her individually.
So I can't see the question box, unfortunately. So if there's anything you'd like me to kind of answer, feel free to chime in. I'm just going to blow through this real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So step 4 is the other tricky part, adaptive capacity. Basically, how much leeway do I have to react to this? So again, I'm going to pick an extreme answer just for the purposes of this demonstration, but the people working in the community are really the only ones that are going to know the answer to that. There's no data set I could pull up that would be able to tell me that. And then we kind of give you a whole host of things that might be a factor. So maybe access to healthcare or safety or just, political climate is a factor. And throughout, you'll see more and more of these. We have these kind of text fields where you can describe what you're thinking. So this is really meant to really help you come up with the vulnerability assessment itself and any notes that you might need to leave yourself while you're doing that. So that's it. This is for the vulnerability assessment piece of drought on agriculture. These are all the questions that we ask you. Is it comprehensive? By no means. Will it get you started? Yes. And then what that allows you to do, this is why I picked those answers, is relatively, if you can imagine kind of going through that process for all of these, you'll see the priority here. So this is what we call adaptive need, which is basically a combination of potential impact and adaptive capacity. So if something is particularly high impact and you have low capacity to react to it, you'd get this box kind of in that upper right-hand corner in the red, which basically says this is a major problem and you should probably focus on this first. If it's the opposite, where it's low impact and you have high adaptive capacity, you'd get kind of a yellowish square, which basically says you can probably back burner this for a little bit. So it's just a visual cue to help users kind of prioritize within that short list. So most people will kind of go through this and complete the vulnerability assessment phase first, but I'm going to jump to taking action just to show you how that works. So this is that strategy database that I was talking about. So this was put together using the PhD work from Missy Stultz and Sierra Woodruff. It's all open source, which is fantastic. So there are a number of cities, towns, counties, and tribal communities whose information is in here. They basically went through and they coded all of the different strategies and what they were in response to. So we have the benefit of basically saying, okay, so San Luis Obispo did this in 2010. You can link out to the San Luis Obispo plan entirely, so you can read it all. But let's just say I particularly like this strategy, which you can see here is relatively general, but maybe I want to use this as a starting point for a strategy that I might implement in my own community. So I can take this and I can change it however I want to. This is just a free text field, so I can make it my own, and then I can think through, well, you know, I think this is a separate project, and I know that my goal is this, and this is how I'm basically going to measure my progress. I can leave myself notes in terms of how I'm going to implement the project. And then this share with other template users is basically just saying, if I keep it private, no one else will see it. If I share the action, that means that I think that this strategy is so good and I've thought through it so well that I'm willing to let other people learn from what I've seen here. So I'm going to put share action. This actually goes through a review process, and if it's kind of deemed to, it's really just to make sure that there's nothing in there that could potentially be maladaptive or harmful to other communities. But if that's found not to be true, it can be one of those suggested actions that shows up in that strategy box. I'm going to keep moving because it's 2:31, but just to really quickly go through the rest of the text boxes, it helps you think through what the outcomes are. So what am I hoping to get out of this strategy? So how is this going to reduce the impact? How does this improve my adaptive capacity? And then who do I have to work with in order to get it done? Maybe I need to work with the city planners, and I need to work with the water department, let's say. And then I can categorize things just so that when I pull this information out, I can keep it all together and organized. And then how am I going to fund it? I'm not going to click on this particular link, but there is a primer that basically says, like, here are 10 different ways that you can fund some of these resilience strategies. We've worked with the University of Maryland's Environmental Finance Center to put those together, and they're really helpful. I mean, it goes through everything, like, you know, green bonds, operational budget, to like public-private partnerships, and so on and so forth. And it has a huge bibliography. Like, all right, here are the communities that actually used these strategies. So again, we're trying to facilitate learning from what others have done so that you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. And then step 6 is just review, and then you get to go back to the dashboard. So I'm gonna stop there because I think it's probably illustrative enough, and just go really quickly through some gaps and opportunities, and I will probably leave it there. We know that there's a lot more information that we could put in here, and we are actively looking for funding to support that work. We know that a lot of people would really like to see, you know, which one of these strategies worked, how much did these action plans cost, were there any unintended impacts, especially from the kind of equity lens. You know, did this have a negative impact on a potentially under-resourced community? And then just kind of general retrospectives. How long did these strategies take to implement? You know, if I'm a community that has a relatively small budget and I'm looking at something that a larger community has implemented, well, that's not apples to apples. I might need to kind of recalibrate things a little bit. A lot of communities don't have vulnerability assessments yet, which means they don't have action plans yet. So we're just trying to foment some action there and help the communities of similar sizes start to get together. But most significantly, a lot of communities are really reticent to share failures, specifically if there's kind of public funds on the line. And that can be really hard. Certainly, it's something that people in public office deal with all the time, but from a from a like planning perspective, it can be really hard to do. But that doesn't mean that we don't have to do it, because this is something that affects all of us. And this entire work that we do is really just to help people get over the kind of the barriers that might be there and kind of get them to a place where they can actually start to do the work. But if everyone was as far along as you guys are, we would be in super good shape. So I'm gonna stop there. I'll just leave my contact up for just a hot second, but I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes longer if there are comments or questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to follow up in separate conversations, emails, what have you.
Thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I'm so excited by this tool. So what I'm just going to say briefly to wrap us up, and I'll stay on for the moment too, is that I will send out our suggested reading for before the next webinar, which will be our last webinar in the series in August. And of course, send the slides, and we'll have the recording available for folks to view later. So I'm actually going to stop recording at this point, but we're just going to stay on. And that way, those who have questions, they can ask you. And so with that, I'm going to stop recording.